Let's pray. Lord, thank you this evening. Thank you that we got a chance to come here and learn from you. Pray that we'll get something, each of us, from this passage this evening, that we'll be challenged and come away having learned more of you. Just pray that you'll help me give across the things that you once said this evening. Just ask now for your help and pray this in your name. Amen. Amen. Yeah, you're right. For the more observant amongst you, you'll realise I'm not Stephen Brind. He's enjoying a surprise 75th birthday party this evening, so he couldn't make it. When Roger was looking for a replacement speaker, he decided to ask the most spiritual member of Bethesda to take the service, but they refused. Then he asked then he asked the most humble member of Bethesda if they could take the service, but they refused as well. So they rang me. Okay, so I accepted. So I felt bad rejecting his request for a third time. Let's read Mark chapter 8, shall we? Mark chapter 8, we'll just read the first 10 verses. If you could follow this in the Bible in front of you, it'd be good, because I'll be dipping in and out of the verses and referring to them as we're going along. So Mark chapter 8, during those days, another large crowd gathered. Since they had nothing to eat, Jesus called his disciples to him and said, I have compassion for these people. They've already been with me 3 days and have nothing to eat. If I send them home hungry, they'll collapse on the way, because some of them have come a long distance. His disciples answered, but where in this remote place can anyone get enough bread to feed them? How many loaves do you have? Jesus asked. 7, they replied. He told the crowd to sit down on the ground. When he'd taken the 7 loaves and given thanks, he broke them and gave them to his disciples to set before the people, and they did so. They had a few small fish as well. He gave thanks to them also, and told the disciples to distribute them. The disciples ate and the people ate and were satisfied. Afterwards, the disciples picked up 7 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. About 4,000 men were present. And having sent them away, he got into the boat with his disciples and went to the region of Dalmanthua. We'll read the rest of the verses in a bit. Just leave that there. Okay, Jesus, if you can see the map behind me, Jesus was previously in Tyre, which is northwest of Israel, where it says Syria. I think it's up by that green top left-hand corner. So he was there in chapter 7, verse 31, which we looked at last week. And then he went over then to an area called the Decapolis. Now, I like a map because it helps us visualize where we are in the world. And we were talking about maps last week in late shift. And Amy said she isn't a fan of maps because unless there's some context to distances, they just don't mean anything. So to keep Amy interested in my PowerPoint this evening, I've got some figures for her and for you. So from Tyre to the top of the Sea of Galilee, which is the big blue bit in the middle, that's a distance of 33 miles. And then he travelled from the top of the Sea of Galilee, then around the eastern coast down into a place near Gadara, which is in the blue Decapolis area, and that's about 15 miles. So you've got about 50 odd miles between the end of chapter 7 and the beginning of chapter 8, which is where we are this evening. And to give it some local context, a few years ago, I walked the length of the Taff Trail, which is 50 miles. It started in Brecon Town Centre and it ends in the big steel ring that's in Roald Dahl Place in Cardiff Bay. That's where it ends. And that's 50 miles. And that took us 2 days at quite a sort of brisk pace. So these are the sort of time scales and distances that you're looking at that Jesus walked to get this area tonight. And this is the area that our story is set in, the Decapolis. Steve Brind last week mentioned this area. The Decapolis is known for having 10 big cities or towns, and the people there are predominantly Gentile. A Gentile is anyone that is not Jewish. We are all Gentiles here this evening. And we're joining Jesus now as he's walking around this area, and crowds are again following him. Wherever he goes, he gets crowds, not because they necessarily believe in him and everything he says, but because he's an interesting person. He divided opinion. He still divides opinion today, doesn't he? So our first 8 verses that we've just read seem like a repeat of a miracle that's happened earlier on. But there are differences. And I've got a table here that I'd like to show us that just show the differences between these 2 miracles. Skeptics argue that this is one of the contradictions in the Bible, but this table shows us, there's some other verses as well, that this feeding miracle is a completely different event. We've got there's 5,000 men, women plus children in the original, or the first miracle. We're told it's 4,000 in this event. There was Jews that predominantly fed in the first miracle, a few chapters previous, but we're told, or we know that it's just Gentiles that were fed on this occasion. The crowd had only been with Jesus one day with the feeding of the 5,000, but we're told that there was 3 whole days that this crowd was with Jesus. These were even more hungry than the 5,000 people that were fed. 5 loaves and 2 fish. We're dealing tonight with 7 loaves and just a few fishes. We're not told the exact number for that. And then we had 12 hand baskets left over of scraps in the first miracle. And this one, we got 7 baskets left over. Less baskets, but there's the difference in the word used for baskets. They've got they're man-sized baskets in this one. When Paul was on the run from people trying to kill him, he was put into a basket and lowered over the wall to escape. And it's this size basket that we've got these scraps left in today. So there's, again, a difference there that you can see between the 2 parables, between the 2 miracles. And if you look at verse 6, notice how Jesus instigates order before he does anything. He told the crowds to sit down. Like the last miracle of the feeding of the 5,000, he got them to sit in groups, and he does exactly the same today, or on this occasion. Order is established before any miracle happens. And the same happened with the healing of Jairus' daughter. If you can remember that story, Mark describes the house as being a bit of a commotion. There's people crying, there's people grieving genuinely, and there's also people who are paid to grieve. And they were there wailing away, but then they ended up laughing at Jesus when he turned up. So these people were paid to pay, which is a strange concept to us, but there was a lot of noise going on at this house. Notice that Jesus just kicks them all out, doesn't do anything until order is restored in that house, and then he does his healing. We've got a God of order. I've noticed while reading these verses, the creation of the world was done in a specific sequence, wasn't it? We all know Genesis and the days and what was created on those days. Evolution says that our world was created from an explosion, and an explosion is disorder, isn't it? It's disarray. It's something that is just a mess, and that's contrary to how God works. The Israelites, when camping in the desert, were instructed to camp in a specific way. Numbers 2 says the tabernacle had to be in the center of the camp, and then depending on the tribe that you were from, dictated where around the tabernacle you were. Some tribes were told to camp on the north, some on the south, some on the east, some on the west. Everything that God does is structured, it's measured. Another example of this is, it's interesting to see how Jesus works with crowds. When the woman was brought before Jesus in adultery, there was a baying crowd, wasn't there? They all wanted her to be stoned. Jesus just bends down, writes something on the ground, not told what it is, says, "Those who haven't sinned, throw a stone," and then carries on writing. Amazing, isn't it? Unorthodox crowd control. And he only deals with that lady once the crowd has gone. That's the only time then that he then speaks to her and deals with the situation. Now, we're here tonight to remember Jesus' death and his resurrection, aren't we? Compare Jesus' usual authority and his usual crowd control to when he carries his cross to Calvary. The streets were lined, weren't they, with crowds just chanting his death. There was disorder going on, wasn't there? He didn't respond. He didn't interact with any of them. He'd given himself over to the chaos and to the disarray that Satan was causing at that time. He said nothing, did he? His usual authority and order of events were being kept back in check. His perfect structure for things, God's perfect structure, was being held back to allow Satan's sort of anarchy and mayhem to take place on that day. But then how grateful are we for God's order to come back into force? Because on that third day then, Satan's power was completely reversed and smashed, wasn't it? The carnage that Satan had created only a few days previously, interestingly, had been completely reversed. And as I was studying for this, I remembered this song, which I thought fits quite well. Then came the morning that sealed the promise. Your buried body began to breathe. Out of the silence, the roaring lion declared the grave has no claim on me. Jesus, yours is the victory. What looked like total defeat came complete victory, didn't it? God had raised Jesus from the dead. I like the irony that God used Satan's disorder and unrest to then see through his perfectly prearranged plan. It's brilliant to see how God is a God of order, and he can use disorder to create his order. He's in charge. He's in complete control of everything. And this is what we're seeing at the start of these miracles. Look at the middle of verse 6. When he had taken the 7 loaves and given thanks, he broke them. So Jesus then spends time giving thanks. He's surrounded by 4,000 starving men, plus women and screaming kids probably. But rather than saying, tuck in, carry on, he makes them wait. He makes them wait. At home, when the boys are hungry and we make them say grace, they say the fastest grace in the world, because grace is seen as an obstacle to them getting their food. But notice Jesus actually he says grace twice. So he makes these people wait even longer. Look at verse 7. He had a few small fish as well. He gave thanks for them also. Jesus had his priorities right, didn't he? Rather than deal with the hungry crowd first, he first acknowledged who had supplied this food. Always say grace. It's so easy, isn't it, to carry on and tuck in and forget who supplies our food in the first place. And also it's a way of showing any non-Christians that you're eating with where your priorities lie. I was thinking as well, it's not just about saying grace. I think it'll do us well to pray and acknowledge God before we do anything, not just eat food. Sarah and I are going through Samuel at the moment, and it's interesting to see how often David inquired before the Lord before he did anything. It's a reminder to us, isn't it, to be constantly grateful to God for thanks and thank him for everything that he's given us. But as David does, thank him before you do anything as well, not just eat. It's a shame as well that this miracle is so overlooked, or it tends to be glossed over, doesn't it? If you say the feeding of a large number of people, the first thing you'll think of is the feeding of the 5,000, not the 4,000. So just because there's 1,000 people less, it doesn't make it any less impressive, does it? There's still a lot of people to feed. When was the last time you saw 4,000 people? Probably at a football match. There's a few more then, wasn't there? It's hard to imagine. So to help us this evening, I found, quite niche this, I found a clip of a Guinness World Record attempt where 3,935 people did a 45-minute trampoline fitness class in Mexico, just to try and give some context to what 4,000 people look like. I don't know if you can make that out, but there's lots of ladies there with a little mini trampoline in front of them trying to break this world record. There's 3,935 of them. So that's how many people Jesus was dealing with, plus women and children, when he gave this food out. So apart from trying to just bring home the scale of this provision, we can't really do much more, can we? We just be full of wonder and amazement at what Jesus can do, how he can provide out of absolutely nothing. For a few fish and loaves of bread, he can completely satisfy the needs, can't he, of anyone that needs from them. Look at verse 10. He got into the boat with his disciples and went to the region of Dalmathu, which could also be called Magdala. We've got a map here of Galilee, 8.74 miles, if you can read the print there. That's the distance they travelled going back. So from the Decapolis, which was the Gentile area, they sailed 10 kilometres back over to Magdala. And this is quite likely where Mary Magdalene came from as well. Now, for a place of Gentiles, where the people were not familiar with Jewish customs or traditions, Jesus saw a glimpse of their faith, didn't he? Remember the lady we looked at last week, who she asked Jesus to heal her daughter, and Jesus says it's not right for the children to take from not right for people to take from children's bread, and not going to give it to dogs, which seems a bit of a harsh comment to make, but she was happy just to take crumbs. She was showing faith, wasn't she? The deaf and the mute man was brought by his friends to get healed by Jesus. They were showing faith. So from that level of faith, from people who were not Jews, Jesus then has got to come across and deal with Jews who show a completely different level of faith. All they want is a sign. Let's just read verse 11 to 13 to remind us what goes on there. So Mark chapter 8, 11 to 13. The Pharisees came and began to question Jesus. To test him, they asked him for a sign from heaven. He sighed deeply and said, "Why does this generation ask for a miraculous sign? I tell you the truth, no sign will be given to it." Then he left them, got back into the boat and crossed to the other side. Now, straight away, it seems he might have even been on the beach. Just as Jesus was coming ashore, he's accosted by these Pharisees and these religious leaders. They're actively trying to search out Jesus to test him and trip him up. There didn't seem to be any let up in their bombardment of giving him hassle wherever he goes. Give us a sign, prove who you are, they said. And verse 12, Jesus sighed inwardly. Now, I'm used to being on the end of a sigh. It's usually because I haven't listened to Sarah. And I think that's what she said anyway. And I get a sigh as well, also off Sam and Elliot, because I just do not understand the text. They have to explain things time and time again. And I'm sure they're sighing. But the sigh that Jesus gave was more than this. It's a sigh from deep within, if you look at the verse. It's an exasperation of willful unbelief from these people. These religious people, these religious leaders, they just didn't want to believe in him. Remember, Jesus sighed when he restored the deafness and the dumbness of the man in the previous chapter. The original Greek for that word is different. Jesus used the word stenazo, which is groaning at the sin that caused this man's disability. But the sigh that Jesus gave here is because of the blatant refusal to believe. So it's a different word. The Greek word used here is anastenazo, which is a deep frustration or a massive disappointment. Imagine Jesus getting frustrated. It's an interesting thought, that, isn't it? A frustrated Jesus. Hebrews 4:15 says this, and the Message version paraphrases it to say, we don't have a priest who is out of touch with our reality. He's been through weakness and testing. He's experienced it all but the sin. So you might be frustrated with someone tonight, or you might be frustrated with something tonight, and Jesus can empathize with that, which is nice to know, is that he knows our frustrations. He feels our disappointments, which someone here might find an encouragement this evening. If any nation was to have a handle on who Jesus was, it should have been the Jews, shouldn't it? If any generation of people was going to be a privileged people, it would have been a generation that see Jesus face to face. And you can see why Jesus sighed, can't you? Because they were looking at him face to face, but they just didn't want to get it. Now, we might get annoyed with the Jews, and we might feel Jesus' frustration, but I wonder how many of us would have been just as skeptical as sat here this evening. Because we're all cynical, really, aren't we? We're British. We're accustomed to getting ripped off, which makes us skeptical. We are used to a poor train service, aren't we? We're used to being ripped off in the shop. We get given customer service, we're all pleasantly surprised, aren't we? It doesn't normally happen. How many of us believe in an estate agent? Just doesn't happen, does it? Imagine lifting our cynical attitudes today and placing them in Galilee. And it would be similar to some of these Pharisees, I think. If we're honest, we'd want to see a lot of proof back in that day before we gave Jesus maybe a green light to see what he has to say. But we've got the benefit of the whole Bible this evening, haven't we? We can see how Jesus fitted not into the Old Testament, but the New Testament as well. We've got a much bigger biblical perspective on the things that, well, we're seeing today. These skeptics in the olden days didn't have what we have this evening. So we've got the whole Bible in our hands, haven't we? Which makes it a challenge to us to be even more trusting of the Lord, because we've been given all this. We're down on the Pharisees, but do we actually have some of their lack of faith in ourselves this evening? Now, we're right to think, aren't we, of the Jews being privileged to meet Jesus, but look how much more privileged we are. How many more truths do we hold on to? We've all got favourite verses, haven't we? Listen to what Peter tells us. This is Peter who always opened his mouth before thinking. This is the Peter who chopped someone's ear off. And now look at this verse here and see how Peter's matured. And with the help of the Holy Spirit, he now realises and he wants to convey to us what we've been brought into. 1 Peter 2 says this, "But you are a royal priesthood, a holy nation. You're a people belonging to God, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light." This is us this evening, isn't it? We've got an understanding that these Old Testament believers, they didn't have. They could only communicate through God, or only communicate to God through a priest. It had to be through a priest. But now we are being told we're priests. We're in the same position as these priests. We're not worshipping God with sacrifices and incense, but we're using our bodies, aren't we, as a sacrifice to him. Just like the Jews were privileged then, now it's our turn to be the privileged ones. This holy nation back in the day that didn't accept him means that we now as the church have become his holy nation. We're in that position. Jesus called the Gentile woman in chapter 7 a dog, which is the same category that we're in. It's interesting to remember Mephibosheth here. He was the son of King David's best friend, Jonathan. He was lame, and he crawled before David and described himself as a dog. And David said, because of your father, I'm going to elevate you and let you eat from my table for the rest of your life. That's us. We now, through Jesus, have been elevated to become his chosen people. We're just not eating crumbs falling from the table, but we're eating at the table this evening. This remembrance service is all about that, being thankful for all that we've been brought into. John 20, Jesus says this to Thomas. Thomas, because you've seen me, you've believed. Well done. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. Jesus said himself that we're blessed this evening. We are blessed. Let's not become hardened to the truths that we're aware of and the truths that we become so accustomed to. Try to remember where we are and what we've been brought into. Look at verse 13. It's at this point that Jesus jumps back into the boat and heads towards Bethsaida. He's not going to waste any more time on willful unbelief. The verse says he left them, which is a bit of a sad verse when you think about it. Jesus leaving them. So he's on the move again. Notice he's not hanging around with those who are wasting his time. And I think there's a quick lesson in there for us. Just not to spend time with people who don't do us any favours. Not to spend time with people who are not going to be helpful for us. Paul says to the Corinthians, I do want to point out, friends, that time is of the essence. There's no time to waste, so don't complicate your lives unnecessarily. Keep it simple in marriage, grief, joy, whatever. Even in ordinary things, your daily routines of shopping and so on. Deal as sparingly as possible with the things this world throws on you. This world, as you see it, is fading away, which is what we were touching on this morning. Jesus would rather spend time with his disciples, so he goes on another trip now across the top of Galilee. This is a 7-mile boat trip towards Bethsaida. Let's read that section in verses 14 to 22, the last section of our verses this evening. The disciples had forgotten to bring bread, except for one loaf they had with them in the boat. Be careful, Jesus warned them. Watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod. They discussed this with one another and said, is it because we have no bread? Aware of their discussion, Jesus asked them, why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not see or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes but fail to see and ears but fail to hear? And don't you remember when I broke the 5 loaves to the 5,000? How many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up? 12, they replied. When I broke the 7 loaves to the 4,000, how many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up? They answered 7. He said to them, do you still not understand? The rest of the verses tonight all happened during this 7-mile boat trip going across the top of Galilee from where they had the discussion with the Pharisees going across now to Bethsaida. Have you ever seen the joke about just having one job? The memes on the internet. It's the despair of seeing someone so inept to have just one job and completely failing. I've got some examples of these now, which I thought are pretty good and get the point across quite well. How many of us have known someone that's had just one job and still managed to fail miserably at it? And I think this is the case Jesus faced when he sat down with his friends in the boat. Verse 14, the disciples had forgotten to bring bread, except for one loaf they had with them in the boat. So it might have been Peter, James, John, we don't know. They'd forgotten to bring supplies. So you can imagine the rolling eyes amongst all the disciples when they found this out. Because if you had to row 7 miles, you'd want a snack, wouldn't you? You would. It's a long way to go because rowing's hard work. And you wonder if the disciples saw the irony of them arguing over one loaf of bread when there was 7 basketfuls over on the shore of the lake they'd just left. Is it because, do you think, I don't know, I'm just asking, that Jesus wanted to leave the Pharisees so quickly that they didn't have time to restock the boat? Because Jesus didn't hang around for long, did he? he got off, faced the Pharisees, and then jumped straight back into the boat. Either way, by the time they realized they didn't have enough bread, it was too late to turn back. And out of nowhere, in verse 15, Jesus says, be careful, watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod. It seems a bit of a random comment, doesn't it? And even the disciples are confused at this comment because they say, is it because we've got no bread? They just couldn't make any sense of it. If you were the disciple who had that one job, it might seem that Jesus is now picking up on your mistake as well, doesn't it? But I wonder if Jesus is still pondering here the attitude of the Pharisees. Remember his deep sigh that he made previously? Their unbelief must have still been going around in his mind. His frustration with these religious leaders and with those in authority was still evident because he brings them up as a warning to his friends. It must have really got to him. Yeast in the Bible is a picture of corruption and evil. So just as a small amount of yeast changes a lot of dough, so a small sin can have a big effect on someone's life. That's the thought here that the Bible's trying to get across. So Jesus' warning about yeast links nicely in with the argument that they're having about bread. But the disciples were missing the point. There's a subtle point that Jesus was making and they missed it. Jesus was saying to his friends that the attitude and unbelief of the Pharisees was dangerous. It corrupts their faith in God. And he was passing on this wisdom to them. He was saying, watch out for hypocrisy, watch out for ritualism, self-righteousness, all these things. Be on your guard against them, he was saying. But they're still a bit bemused, these disciples. So to bring their minds back into focus, Jesus fires off 9 quick questions at them. So I just thought we could spend about 15 minutes going through each question before we go into open worship. First question was this. The first 5 in verse 17 linked to their ignorance and their lack of faith. Question 1, why are you still talking about no bread? Number 2, do you still not see or understand? Number 3, your heart's hardened? Do you have no eyes but not see? Do you have ears that don't hear? Bang, 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 bang. If you were the disciples, you'd be thinking a bit, whoa, Jesus isn't messing around here. What's going on? The last 4 questions serve as reminders and a bit of a rebuke as well, that they're worried and they're fussing about this lack of bread. Look at the end of verse 18. Number 1, don't you remember? Number 2, when I broke the loaves, the 5,000, how many baskets of leftovers did you pick up? Number 3, when I broke the 7 loaves, the 4,000, how many baskets of leftovers did you pick up? Number 4, do you still not understand? Jesus is giving the disciples a bit of a hard time here, isn't he? These disciples were sat next to the creator of the universe, the sustainer of all things, and yet they still needed constant reminding of just who he was. You can see the frustration of Jesus here, can't you? They were worrying about how they're going to eat. Plus, they'd missed his message or his warnings about the Pharisees and the unbelief of them. Like a father that goes over the basics or reminds his children and repeats events to them just to reinforce a lesson. So Jesus is doing this with his spiritual children. He's going over things. He gives them 5 rhetorical questions to highlight their lack of faith. And then the last 4 questions remind them of what faith can achieve. We're a forgetful people. We are. Back in the Old Testament, the Israelites moaned and complained in the desert about a lack of water. So God provided water for them out of a rock. Moses called it Moriah, which means testing or quarreling. So they had their prayer answered. But towards the end of their time in the desert, they were moaning again. They were complaining. They'd forgotten. And it was here that Moses hit the rock. He should have spoken to it, but he hit it. And the water came out and they had their prayers answered. But the Israelites had forgotten the first miracle of God providing water from a rock. And their forgetfulness was resulting in their lack of faith. It was resulting in their moaning. They'd been sustained for 40 years. You'd think they'd remember where their water was coming from, but they'd forgotten. And the disciples had also forgotten 2 miracles that happened literally a week apart. We are forgetful people. And that's why we're here tonight. God knows that we need to be reminded of his miracles. So he came up with this simple idea of bread and wine. They're reminders of a miracle, isn't it, that we have benefited from. It was on the cross, wasn't it, that biggest miracle took place. Someone who had done no wrong took on himself the wrong of anyone that has ever lived. So we've been reading, haven't we, of how Jesus provided physically for the crowd by offering bread. He provided spiritually to his disciples by giving them warnings about the Pharisees. How much more has he provided for us this evening? As we go into open worship now, let's remember this provision that Jesus has made of himself for us. And then Mark records Jesus later on saying this: "For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. Let's thank him now for all that we've been brought into and his sacrifice for us.